Let's get right into it. World War II. It's the most devastating conflict in human history, an event that literally reshaped the modern world as we know it. In this explainer, we're going to map out exactly how the whole thing happened, tracking it from the very first sparks all the way to the final ashes.
To make sense of this massive geopolitical earthquake, we're following a really clear timeline. We'll start with the roots of the conflict, then look at the sheer shock of Blitzkrieg and the early victories. From there, we track how the war expands globally, hit the major turning points, follow the massive Allied counteroffensive, and wrap up with the total collapse and the wild aftermath.
Section 1. Roots of the Global Conflict. The Embers of WW1.
You know, the end of the First World War actually planted the seeds for the second. Just wrap your head around this number, $33 billion. That's the staggering amount in financial reparations forced onto Germany by the Allies through the Treaty of Versailles. And that came with a war guilt clause, basically forcing Germany to shoulder all the blame for the previous war. To put that in perspective, in today's money, we're talking nearly $270 billion. As you'd expect, this absolutely decimated their economy.
And that economic freefall led to something truly mind-boggling. By 1923, hyperinflation was so out of control that a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion German marks. Imagine that. Millions were unemployed, people were starving, and it created this atmosphere of just pure despair. And it's in exactly these desperate moments that people become highly receptive to radical dictators. Enter Adolf Hitler, who manipulated the masses with propaganda, scapegoated minorities like the Jews, and promised to restore Germany to its former glory.
Now, to really grasp the motives driving this impending European conflict, we have to look neutrally at this core Nazi ideology known as Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler's endgame wasn't just revenge, right? It was territorial conquest, specifically in the East, to create room for what he considered a racially pure Aryan population. That ideology made a massive expansionist war practically inevitable. Meanwhile, over in the Pacific, Japan felt totally cheated by Western powers and started aggressively pushing into China for natural resources. And down in Italy, the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was dreaming up a brand new empire in the Mediterranean. The powder keg was set.
And the Allied strategy to handle this? Appeasement, which, spoiler alert, completely failed. Hitler just kept taking. First, he annexed Austria without a fight. Then he demanded the Sudetenland. Britain and France actually said, sure, take it, just promise to leave the rest of Czechoslovakia alone. Hitler signed the paper, and then, well, he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. To top it off, he signed a secret non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union so they could carve up Poland together. Finally, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France had absolutely no choice but to declare war.
Section 2. Blitzkrieg and Early Victories. The Fall of Europe.
The official start of the war unleashed a terrifying new military tactic on the world. The Polish army fought incredibly hard, but they were totally blindsided by Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Hitler was absolutely desperate to avoid a repeat of the dragged-out trench warfare of WW1, so he needed things to be short and incredibly fast. By combining fast-moving tanks with tightly coordinated air support from the Luftwaffe, they just completely overwhelmed defenders before they could even process what was happening.
When Hitler turned his sights on France in 1940, the mismatch was just wild. The French were still leaning on outdated WW1 tactics. We're talking horses, motorbikes for running messages, static defenses like the Maginot Line. The Germans? They shoved a massive mechanized armored force right through the Ardennes forest, an area the Allies thought was totally impassable for tanks. And here's a crazy fact. To maintain this blistering, non-stop pace, German troops were heavily fueled by Pervitin. That is essentially crystal meth. It allowed them to fight for days without sleeping. The shock factor was absolute.
Because of that blinding speed, massive Allied armies were quickly encircled and pushed right to the sea. But then we get a miracle. 350,000. That's the sheer number of trapped Allied troops that were miraculously pulled off the beaches of Dunkirk during Operation Dynamo. It was an unbelievable, desperate effort where civilian fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, and naval ships sailed right into enemy fire to bring those guys home. They saved the men, but France still fell. And suddenly, Britain was standing completely alone in the West.
Section 3. The war expands globally, from London to Pearl Harbor. With France out of the picture, the conflict rapidly jumped the English Channel and spread across the globe.
Hitler was gearing up to invade Britain, but he knew he needed to control the skies first. So he ordered these relentless bombing raids on London, intentionally targeting civilians to just crush their spirit. But British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously declared, "We shall never surrender." And man, they didn't. The public morale was absolutely ironclad. People slept in subway stations, sent their kids to the countryside, and just kept going. Ultimately, the Royal Air Force fought off the Luftwaffe, and Hitler had to completely shelve his invasion plans.
At this point, the conflict morphed into this high-stakes battle of tech and endurance. Out in the Atlantic, German U-boats were sinking supply ships left and right, trying to starve Britain out. That threat was only neutralized when the brilliant Alan Turing and his team cracked the German Enigma code. And things were getting so desperate that Allied engineers seriously considered building an aircraft carrier out of pykrete, a literal mix of wood pulp and ice. Thankfully, they scrapped that one. Over in Africa and the Balkans, Mussolini's campaigns were failing so badly that Hitler constantly had to siphon off his own troops to go bail him out.
Then, in 1941, 3 rapid-fire events flipped the whole war on its head. First, Hitler betrayed Stalin. He launched Operation Barbarossa, throwing 3 million troops into the Soviet Union, chasing that ultimate ideological goal. Second, the legendary Russian winter hit. German troops literally froze in their tracks just outside Moscow because they didn't have winter gear, giving the Soviets the perfect opening to push back. Third, halfway across the world, Japan launched a total surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor to clear a path into Southeast Asia. In one fell swoop, the United States was dragged right into the center of the fight.
So, let's look at the board. You've got the Axis powers dominating Europe, carving up Africa, and sweeping across the Pacific. You have to ask, how on earth did the Allies come back from that? Well, this is exactly where the tide turns, and the reckless speed of the Axis advance finally catches up with them.
Section 4. The major turning points. The Axis momentum halts.
These are the massive, pivotal clashes that finally shattered the myth that the Axis forces were invincible. We're talking 3 decisive victories that wrecked Axis supply lines and wiped out military power they simply couldn't replace. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy intercepted Japanese plans, laid a trap at Midway, and sank multiple aircraft carriers. Japan's Navy never recovered from that. Over on the Eastern Front, you have the absolute meat grinder of Stalingrad. The Soviets fought for every single street, eventually trapping the entire German Sixth Army and forcing their surrender. And down in North Africa, the British scored a massive win at El Alamein, effectively squeezing Axis forces entirely out of the continent.
Section 5. The Allied counteroffensive, closing the jaws.
Now the Allies had the momentum. They launched this highly coordinated geographic squeeze, closing the jaws on the occupied territories from the south, west, and east. First, they push up through Sicily and into Italy, which actually leads to Mussolini being overthrown by his own people. Second, June 6, 1944, D-Day. A staggering, meticulously planned amphibious invasion of Normandy, France, breaking the German lines in the west. And third, out in the Pacific, U.S. forces under General Nimitz were executing a brutal island-hopping campaign. They were fighting tooth and nail for these tiny, remote islands just to inch their bombers closer to the Japanese mainland.
Of course, Hitler wasn't done quite yet. He threw everything he had left into one desperate final push through the Ardennes, creating the Battle of the Bulge. They completely surrounded American troops in the freezing town of Bastogne and demanded they surrender. The American commander's response? A legendary, defiant, one-word message: nuts. The Americans stubbornly held the line, Patton's army broke the siege, and Hitler's final gamble totally collapsed.
Section 6. Total collapse and aftermath. A new world order.
The final months of this war are just a harrowing sequence of events. The Soviet Union steamrolled all the way into Berlin. Realizing it was entirely over, Hitler took his own life in his bunker, and Germany formally surrendered in May 1945. But the Pacific War was still raging. Following incredibly bloody fighting on the island of Okinawa, the Allies were staring down a catastrophic mainland invasion of Japan. To force an immediate surrender, the U.S. deployed a terrifying new technology. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly reducing both cities to ash. In September, Japan officially surrendered. The 6-year global nightmare was finally over.
But look at what was left behind. The entire geopolitical landscape was completely rewritten. The old fascist empires? Gone. Germany was split right down the middle between the Allies, eventually becoming East and West Germany. In Japan, the occupying forces made the emperor publicly strip away his own divine status. We went from a world with multiple competing empires to a globe totally dominated by just 2 massive heavyweights, the United States and the Soviet Union.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer, and a final thought for you to chew on. World War II was without a doubt more destructive than anything humanity had ever seen. But as the smoke finally cleared, with 2 victorious superpowers now staring each other down, armed with vastly different ideologies, capitalism on one side, communism on the other, how quickly do you think this hard-fought peace would freeze right into a Cold War? The end of World War II didn't really bring absolute peace. It just set the stage for a completely new kind of global tension. Thanks for joining me on this one. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.